Hello, computer science students. Welcome back. Um, so in this video, we're kind of continuing where we left off in our last one. In the last video, we talked about super. Specifically, we talked about an example where we called super in the toString method. And this one's actually pretty tricky. We'll talk about a couple other tricks to this as we go through. I just kind of gave it to you, but we're going to talk a little bit more detail about it in the future. We talked about being able to call methods with super. It turns out it's relatively rare that you want to do this, but it is possible. And it's going to have to go back into our override conversation when we get to it. So I'm gonna circle back to that one. But super is something you can do. You can call a super method, super classes method that way. The other thing we talked about was inheritance, the fact that methods are inherited from the person class to the Phoenix cardholder class. And if we make a Phoenix cardholder object, we can call classes or methods from our superclass um, because they're inherited. So the next thing we want to talk about here, and let me go ahead and mark this off our list. The next thing we want to talk about here is overloading, and this one turns out it's gonna be a little bit, hopefully a little more straightforward. Um, Let me give you a reminder about how overloading works in general. I could create an overloaded constructor by doing this. Phoenix card holder. Maybe here we take no inputs, or maybe we just take one. Let's just do one. Let's do string person ID. So maybe we want to add a person. We're not sure what their last name and first name are, which is probably not good. And we really realistically wouldn't want to do this. But we could try. And so person ID, and then we just set last name maybe to blank, first name maybe blank. Phoenix card ID would be blank. And block meals would be 0 for sure. So I've now overloaded the constructor. So now there's two ways to make Phoenix cardholder objects. One with all four pieces of information required by the first constructor, and one with just one string, which would call a second constructor, right? So this is called overloading. This is having one method with two different sets of inputs that do two slightly different things. So that's for a constructor. Really quick overload of a random method I choose here. Let's do set block meals. Maybe we do set block meals with no inputs, which might mean that we would be setting block meals equal to 0. Maybe set block meals with no input just means we default set it to 0 or something. But if we look at it, we now have two set block meals methods. One takes an int, one takes nothing. This is an overloaded method. You can also overload methods, basically overload methods across even inherited methods. So we have inherited a set last name method. In Phoenix cardholder, we can do something like public void set last name. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. Yeah, public void set last name. The superclass takes in a string to set the last name. We could, although shouldn't, override it and do set last name to allow us to set our last name in our superclass to be empty or something. And so to do that, we would do, we could do it a couple ways. Let's do super.set last name with nothing in quotes. And now we've overridden set last name so that if we provide a last name, it will be set based on how the person class works. If we do not provide an input, then we're just going to set it equal to blank on our own. And in fact, in this case, we don't even technically have to use super. This will work just the same because the inputs are different. And so if I try to do set last name with a string input, I can't go back and call this same set last name method again because this one requires no input. So instead it's going to look for another option, and the other option is the inherited option from person, which again is kind of like invisibly in the class. So just to show you that this works, let's do pc.setLastName and set it with nothing, and then print it out again. Oops. There we go. So we're going to see that their last name is Jones. Then we're going to set it using our overloaded method we just created. And it will overload it, and it will overwrite their last name with blank. And so let's skip the container example and do the Phoenix card holder example. And if we look now at this part in our code, the Phoenix card holder's last name used to be Jones, now it is blank. So we have overloaded a method from Phoenix card holder in person. And we don't even have to use the keyword super. It's something we talked about in our last video. The only real reason you have to use the keyword super is if you have overridden a method and you want to call the overridden method. So again, we're going to circle back to what that means and why we need to use it in our next video here. But for overloading, you don't actually need to use super. You can just call set last name with the correct type of inputs. Because again, the way inheritance works is that the set last name method from person is like it's inherited, or it's almost like it's invisibly written here in our Phoenix card holder class, right? We can call set last name just like we could call other methods, right? We could call set block meals in here. Wouldn't make sense to, but we could. We could set block meals to 5, or set block meals to 0, and that's fine. And if you'll notice that Eclipse does slightly different colorings. This is calling an inherited method. This is calling a method in the class. But that's how inheritance works. You can inherit methods, you can call them and use them like you would methods in your own class. Overload, and you can overload them like you would overload methods in your own class. So different inputs, same method name, totally okay. It allows either one to be called as needed. All right. So I'll see you next time to talk more about overriding, which gets a little more complicated. We've seen a little glimpse into that, and what that ultimately does. So overriding is a little bit of a tricky concept, and we'll spend a little extra time on it. So I'll see you guys next time.